Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my channel. Now, if you've been following along, Chapter 5 got pretty lengthy and we didn't even finish it because, I was uploading them in sections and somehow I deleted the last section, and when I was done with the videos, I deleted the raw footage of me reading. So we're going to pick this up here. We're going to finish up Chapter 5, and then we're going to go into Chapter 6 and finish that up as well. So to recap Chapter 5 so far, Ingrid has dropped Talia and Mathis off at Ninnersog, where they found some lodging for the night and some food, and upon retiring to their beds, Talia had a dream where she was visited by Key. And Key delivered her a message to say, do not release Azra. So after waking up, she wrote it down in her journal, and then the two of them, Talia and Mathis, made their way out of Ninnersog, where we left them off at a giant wall of stairs. Please, Mathis turned to Talia with an already defeated look. Tell me you have another worm friend in the neighborhood that you can get a hold of for a ride out of town. Afraid not, she answered with an unempathetic smile. Mathis slumped. But I can do this. Talia grabbed Mathis by the shoulder and bobbed her head. With a popping of the ears, both stood several flights up. What? He turned to Talia with a surprised look on his face. What was that? That was nothing, she answered, aloof and coy. Wait, I know Aztecs have their fair share of the arcane powers, but, he stammered as he gestured over the cliff and then back to where they stood. But that's no power of nature as certain as the eclipse. Mathis, she pushed past him with her own stern look, but stopped short and turned to face him with sincerity in her eyes. Old friend, you have your stories to tell me, and when I have my own figured out, I will tell you. Besides, I was hoping you would know the answer to that. You seem to know everything else, but I suppose you're just as surprised now as I was when I first did it. She placed her hand on his shoulder and smiled and bobbed her head again. Once more they found themselves higher up, though this time with a dizzying stop. About 6 years ago, several marauders took me by surprise outside the tower. I thought, I must get to the warning bell, and then I saw the light. And in the blink of an eye, I was at the bell spire. Her head bobbed again and again. This is not the only thing I can do since the light showed up either, she said with a heavy breath as they found themselves at the top of the climb. She continued to breathe heavily. That is always a workout. She fell to her knees and loosened some furs to help cool her down. What else can you do? Give me a minute, she said with thick puffs of misty steam. She looked around at the land below as she caught her breath, the town almost lost below in the swirl of snowy sheets. I can send things about a minute forward in time. Talia moved from her knees to sit on her rear and dug through her garments. She found what she was looking for, pulled out a metal star, and casually tossed it to Mathis. But as he reached to grab it out of the air, Talia gestured to grab it herself, and the star vanished. Where'd it go? He asked. Talia shrugged. All I know is it will return in about a minute, and at the same spot it disappeared from, and in the same motion. So either stay ready to catch it or get out of the way, she said with a teasing smile. Mathis kept his eye on the spot where the star had been, and he stepped aside. Though, to be honest, she continued, I think it may be like when we were ascending the wall, more so than when I store things away. Stored things cannot be recalled in motion. Her body had cooled down enough, and the chill of the frosty heights was starting to cool her too much, and she bundled herself back up. But she was still a bit tired from the exertion, and she remained where she sat. Her eyes followed Mathis as he circled around the spot where the star was to appear, but not a full circle, as he kept cautious to stay out of its expected path. Sure enough, just as Talia said, the star appeared as it continued its arc through the air and down to crunch in the snow. That one showed up only a couple years ago, and at first it was only a few seconds, but now she gestured to the item on the ground while she stood up, somewhere around a minute. So, Mathis began to wonder, if the two powers are the same, then that means you could nod yourself into the future? Again, Taya shrugged. We should get on the road. After all, we do not have the horses anymore. Even though the wall was far behind, they continued to climb as the rim thrust up above them. As they climbed higher, the winds became stronger, and the light from the Otten grew dimmer as the daylight hours faded. Both Talia and Mathis saved their strength for the hike and spoke little, except to offer some help up onto ledges and such. There did not even seem time to reflect on things, as they needed their focus to ascend the road, which became increasingly dangerous. The winds whipped by, and the danger quickly turned treacherous as Talia felt her footing slip out from beneath. She tried to reach out for anything, and her heart skipped a beat as her fingers brushed the sidewall without getting a grip. Face first, she hit the packed sheet of snow with a grunt and began to slide downward. A streak of blood marked its way down the path as she slid. With a slam of her hands on the ground, the hidden barbs wrapped up in her palms dug into the ice. She spread her legs and jammed her feet to the sidewalls, and thankfully she slowed to a stop. Mathis had seen it all happen and steadied himself to catch her, but he eased up when she saw she had caught herself. "Maiden," he yelled out over the wind, "are you alive?" "Bit my lip!" She wiped the blood away and righted herself. "I'll be better once we reach the refuge for the night." "Salamu, eh?" Mathis brightened up. "That place is still in use?" Figured it would be buried by now, he thought. He cracked an affectionate smile in memory. I had my first kiss there. "Salamu? No," she responded. "That place was buried by an avalanche a couple years ago." Talia continued up the path as Mathis's heart sank a little bit. "We are looking for Barag," she continued as she walked ahead. "It is a cave system found last year, not too far away. Maybe another hour of climbing. While there, we can rest for the night, and in the morning we can use the tunnels to cross into the crater without having to summit Nin." The rest of the climb went smoothly as the road's incline eased up. It made several twists and turns up the steep face, but they did not need to make it all the way up. Talia led Mathis off the road and onto a small and somewhat newly carved pathway. The walls of the path rose up and over them to connect, and they soon found themselves in an icy yet strangely warm tunnel. "Mathis? Maiden?" "I suppose I should ask, to which crater are we going? Barag has a route directly to Maru Aga and a connection to the rim of Mara Aga." "Actually, neither. We're heading to the pass between the crown and the great crater of the west." "Melamu?" Mathis laughed inwardly as he saw Talia flinch. "And I know what you're going to say, so keep walking. Yes, I know we could have taken the road that led along Parrot and Scar directly to Melamu in the pass. But this place is one of our strange places, and believe it or not, it can only be reached by descending into it from the rim of Maru Aga." "I believe it, old friend." Talia shook her head as she walked. "There are a couple of other places I know of that are like that." She paused and thought a moment. "We should continue to the refuge for the night, as planned. When morning comes, we will backtrack to get to the rim." Silence held the next few minutes as they walked along. Eventually, Talia could not help but bring up her dream. "In your travels, have you ever heard of a being named Ki?" "Actually, maybe. At Heliodum, in fact. Though I can't say I could read or understand much. Ki is a member of a pantheon, and that's about all I know." "Is that all there was at Heliodum?" "Not at all," he answered. "There's so much. You're welcome to try and decipher it along with me when we get there. I had no idea about these shortcuts when I planned this all out, so it'll give us a little time for study." "Why do you ask?" "So, Ki does have something to do with all this then." She did not really speak to Mathis. "Pardon?" he asked. "Last night, while I was dreaming, he said his name to me and said not to release Azra." "Interesting. And you have never heard of Ki before?" I'm not surprised by that, but for him to reveal himself tells me that I'm not crazy, he laughed. So relieved. Strangely, old friend, I am too, she smiled. The warmth of the tunnels had subtly risen as they walked deeper in. The icy walls became damp and not so icy, and a thin mist filled the air. Soon they passed the mists and reached a cavern that widened out. Pockmarked with thermal vents and hot springs, it surprisingly had a couple of other travelers taking advantage of the water's welcoming and relaxing benefits. Though they did not stay for welcome company, most of the cavern folk kept their distance from outsiders, and with her veil of light, Talia was most certainly an outsider. You didn't say there'd be hot springs, Mathis hurried past Talia. The warmth of the springs soaked deep into their muscles as they laid back and relaxed. From time to time, they took a dip below the surface to let the dirt of their trek wash away. Tell me, Mathis. She swirled her hair in the water as her light rippled around. From what you say, Ganon was once gifted and gave up his gifts. Does that mean he is just a normal person now? Normal as one of his world can be, I would think. He dipped down further into the water to enjoy its warmth. He let the water come to just below his nose and spoke again, bubbles of all sorts popping and plopping as he spoke. Oh, it feels so good. Talia's voice echoed around as she laughed. Is there any more you can tell me about him? He's a misunderstood soul, Mathis slid back up. The people of the township who've seen him tell undue stories about him, but all he's ever really done is keep watch to make sure no one stumbles across. He stopped to consider whether he should tell Talia about Ganon's tragedy. Stumbles across what? Talia, Mathis started resolutely. Something happened to Ganon some time ago. Chapter 6. The Forest That Screams. The forest sat heavy with grief in the hovering twilight. That is how it has been since Ganon diminished, turning into a feathered and gaunt-looking serpent, what his people called Saharu. Since his kind were from the manifold, within the fold, their presence was a thing to behold. In the fold, the presence of one who was Saharu took from everything around them. Just being alive took, in one way or another, from everything around them. His sibilant tongue spat hatred into the shadows, and it brought to this place the disparaging air of his regression. His despair tugged at the soul. His entrapment on this world brought him down to such depths that it oozed out to touch all around. None could stand against it. Flowers would wilt when Saharu dared to cry. But it had not always been so. The year is now 1060 by the nocturnal calendar. Before the times of rot and unease, before he was Saharu, there had once been a wondrous beauty to the forests below Karol. Ganon's presence, just being there, would tend to the beauty of the place as he stalked through the trees. After all, the presence of those from the manifold was a thing to behold. Always peering from beyond the cover of the darkest woods, careful not to let the people of the land see his true form, seemed the only recourse to bring him happiness. Aleo was long dead, and he had nothing else. So, in the dark of the shadows he remained, tending to the life to which he resigned himself, guardian of the forest. One day, he caught the scent of something wondrous, and he looked to the winds with intent. Strolling in the western foothills of Argaria, there came along a young lady. Not just any young lady. He had seen that one come for several evenings in a row. His tending to the forest at a pause, Ganon could not help but be in her thrall, even from a distance. Flowers filled the eastern foothills of Karol, and those rolling hills gave way to rising heights of peaks that heaved themselves upon a sky set ablaze by the ever-steady northern twilight, splashed with the hues that promised a stormy night to come. In those hills, he first saw her, and he wished for her to come closer, at least within earshot, nothing more. He wanted only to hear her laughter, to hear her purity. Yet again, as the clouds encroached to darken the sky and extinguish the fires of twilight, she thought to return home, and again Ganon had been left to sulk among the shadows, ever alone. Oh, such torments steal in among my soul. He spoke the tongue of his people, and his melodious tone crushed the air and brought the breeze to rustle the leaves of all branching things. Such a bitter and foul torment. Woodland creatures listened from afar to the mandrake's soliloquy. I have yearned for my suffering to end for far too long, and I have received nothing. But now I have found something, and a wondrous something it is. How I delight in it. Never has such a chaste soul entranced me as this. Beyond reason do I dare to love again. He stopped and, through a break in the canopy, spied Azra-Loon just as the nighttime clouds began to encroach. Azra-Loon, he chirped curtly, how you mock me with your guiltless stare. Bereft of any knowledge that you have trapped me here, alone, going insane. I dared to live and love and build a life here once before, but such was not meant to be then. Beyond reason do I dare to love now. After a pause, he answered his own question. Indeed I do. The night lured him to sleep-haunting dreams, and above the enclave of the benighted glen, the heavy clouds became a beast that thundered and thankfully badgered him from sleep. He awoke to the beauty of the forest garden. Seeing it just beyond his hidden briar patch soothed him. He found solace in the effulgent glow of the moonflowers and phlox. Through the haze of wakening dreams, it all looked like an ethereal vision of celestial plains. Dwelling in solitude and listening to the patter of rain that fell through the night, he felt comforted enough to let sleep take him away once more. Twilight grew brighter, clouds gave way to sky, and muted morning gave way to nuanced noon, as, again, the girl came along. She stayed her distance, though, never to be too close to the forest. She had heard the stories about the forest below Carol, the forest that screams. So she stayed among the flowered hills, beneath the violet sky, and stayed safely away from the Void Eater. That is what the township called Ganon, because he was once seen as he ate a buck whole, and he appeared to be black as moonless night, but that was long ago. He was no longer in the grip of superior beings. The girl waltzed to the wind and sang an angelic reverence to the clouds. The birds in the air fell in love with her, and they sang as well. But in the east, the sky grew dark as it had the day before. Unheeded by the girl, the sky only grew darker as she amused herself. In between picking herbs and berries, the girl rolled and spun and chased the butterflies and grasshoppers all about the hillside. So much so as to feel weariness begin to nip at her. A small nap, she thought, would be harmless. Amid the lilies she lay and closed her eyes to the passing clouds above. As she drifted to sleep, an ominous shadow drifted over the land and swept across her body. The eastern sky gathered with clouds so dark that they looked ready to burst open with black rain. Above the clouds, and the reason for the clouds to look so black, a dark splotch stained the face of Azra-Loon. The stain washed across half of the moon from west to east, covering its lower half. Azra-Loon sank into the shadows of nocturne in a lunar eclipse that bathed the south in cold, unfeeling light. Deeply she slept beneath the ashen veil, long enough for the bitter storm to brew overhead and lightly drop its bitter waters on her. Her dreaming, lidded eyes fluttered with the touch of raindrops on her face. But when the cold whisper of a wet breeze shot past her nape, she awoke with a start. The girl, her dream still with her, thought this only another uneasy vision, and the gathering storm frightened her. Beyond the storm's great spires, she could discern the unmistakable crescent of the eclipse. In the clouds, she saw many wicked faces and forms wreathed in lightning, phantoms and wraiths on the back of the wind. In terror, she fled from them and ran into the south, across the hills to the foot of Ganon's forest, close enough to hear the forest as it whispered to her, calling out her name. 2 great oaks flanked the path that led into the forest, and she stood before the ominous sight with fear of the storm on her heels and dread of the forest on her toes. The twilight sky over Corol continued to cloud over under the shadow of Azra-Loon with an oppressive darkness. Yet the forest pathway seemed to glow of its own accord, ever so slightly. With a flash of lightning at her back, all she sought was refuge, and the forest offered that better than the open hills. Going against all she had known about entering the forest, she set foot between the two oaks and slipped away from the encroaching dark. An earthen road held the divide between the great parade of trees, and lined with patches of ivy that grew into the misted dark, seemed more peaceful than she had expected. To either side of the path, fireflies flashed with their green streaks through the empty spaces. What lay beyond in the shadowy distance only the forest knew. An unsettling fear held to her as she ventured farther in, and to help herself stay focused, she spoke aloud reassurances and calming words. Stories! She remembered the tales told of this forest and its inhabitant. That's all they are. Tales told to scare children and keep them on a chosen path. A slight noise to her left made her pause and peer in that direction. Well, she slowly turned her head forward while keeping her eyes locked on the unseen source. With tentative footsteps, she continued onward. I'm not a child any longer, and that which is merely hearsay is nothing really to fear at all. To whom do you speak? The command of the heavily accented voice caught her off guard. She spun around, lost her balance, and fell onto a patch of ivy. Whose voice is this? Her fright betrayed her as cracks welled up in her voice, but no answer came. I'll ask once more. She regained her composure as she stood. And if no answer comes, then I will leave and never come back. She looked about apprehensively, first at the fireflies in the distance, and then to the canopy's branches and leaves. Who asks this question of me? The girl balled up her fists. Please, Gannon spoke up. Be not so hasty. I have never heard such a gentle voice, and I was taken for a moment. I have also never seen any creature such as yourself within my forest for quite some time. Not since the Exodus. Aaliyah, he thought. How I miss you. The Exodus? She did not know if she should be startled or intrigued, yet something compelled her to continue. You've been here that long? Then something came to her. Are you the exile we all hear stories of? No, he said. I am not him. The girl looked around, still unsure. You've been here a long time, though, haven't you? A long silence held the forest, as even the trees dared not to breathe. Will you honor me with the gift of your name? He asked. I may, she replied. Are you going to answer my questions? I may, he answered back. Both surprisingly shared a laugh. It had been so long since anything but a muddled breath had slipped past his scaled lips. Tell me, what brings you into my forest? There's a storm, she pointed back the way she came, and an eclipse. Yes, I've seen them approaching for a while now, he said, curious that you did not. I had fallen asleep in the hills, but the storm, I saw its spires and they were frightening, more so than any story I've heard of the forest, so I came here to seek refuge. Refuge you shall have, he granted. Go where I tell you to, and nothing outside this forest will harm you this night. Gannon could see the intensity of the storm, and the time had come for him to put the rumors to rest. But my parents, she wondered aloud, they'll be cross with me should I not come home. The storm is growing, and if you left now, I do not think you would make it home, but I'm sure it will pass before morning. Lightning lit up the forest with a crack of thunder loud enough to rattle the bones, and the girl knew he was right. Please, he urged, I know of a place you may stay. But you speak to me from the shadows. I do not think it prudent of me to accept your offer as long as you stay hidden. She took a step back and glanced the way she came. Forgive me, he started, but my image may be shocking to you, so I will stay out of your sight. Though my intentions are pure, I assure you. I merely wish to help. I shall take you near the center of the woods. Its canopy is thick, and the icy rains rarely make it through. You will be safe there. I have heard things about this place. I understand, he said. I am sure many people have some tale to tell about how they saw me. Not many, but there are stories. I'm sorry if what others have said about me frightens you. I do only wish to help. The storm will pass in several hours, and if you go now, I do not think you will make it home. You may stay here if you wish, I will take my leave and bother you no more. Though should you change your mind, I will leave a clear path for you to follow." He stood from behind a tree to let her see his shadowy form. Her eyes widened at how tall and broad he seemed. Ganon turned around to leave as his heavy footsteps thumped off into the distance. He kicked his way through the brush and out of sight until he made no sound at all. A few drops started to click and clap against the leaves above, and the stories crept back among her thoughts. She did all she could to set them aside as another flash of lightning and rumble of thunder ripped the sky apart. With one foot in front of the other, she moved onto the newly trodden path as the darkening umbra claimed the road behind her. The eclipse chased her into the woods. Further into the unfamiliar she slipped. Long unspoken minutes passed along with the trees while the storm gained strength overhead. Soon she found herself deep in the wild growth of the forest, under the cover of the thickly grown canopy, safe from the rain. Past ferns and fallen trees and through the thicket she traveled, but not one bit of it hindered her, for no bush or tree stood in the way. A path certainly had been cleared. As she walked and walked, there seemed to glow a light just beyond the approaching tree-lined hill rise. She wondered what it could be, until at last she came to an embowered path that opened wide to a glade that took her breath away. Hundreds of fireflies zipped and flashed in all directions to illuminate nocturnal flowers and bring light to the darkest recesses. In awe, she stumbled her way in as she looked around to take in the wondrous sight. With a smile, she reached out to grasp at the passing flashes of light. "You decided to come," Ganon called from the distance. "Where are we?" She turned the direction of his voice. "A sanctuary of sorts," he answered, "though I only come here when the rains get severe. I'm glad you have come. We will be safe here from the strength of the storm." "Thank you for helping me. That was quite a long walk to get here, and I don't mean to seem rude, but I should like to rest now. I'm exhausted." "Of course," Ganon replied. "There are many places around where you may rest." He paused. "But please, do not go near the western approach. A foul presence resides there. Stay within this glade where I can see you, and you will be safe. I will be near the large stone just atop the eastern rise, should you need anything." He started to walk away. "Wait," she yelled out. "What's your name?" He stopped and turned over his shoulder. "Ganon." "I'm Aaron." "Good night, Aaron." The storm had come and gone while the lighter shades of twilight returned to the skies over Corral. As Aaron slept soundly in a patch of soft ivy, Ganon had ventured a small distance away to collect berries and other edible items. In one hand he cupped a handful of berries, lettuce, and grains, while in the other hand he picked at things in the undergrowth here and there. An earthworm wriggled between his lips. The morning peace felt broken with a rush of birds that cried out as they flapped off into the air, chased by a short scream that quickly muffled off into silence. Ganon stood tall while half the worm fell to the ground, and he looked to the glade where he had left Aaron. As fast as could be, he broke out into full sprint. His tightened grip squeezed from the berries a deep red juice that splattered across the ground. Only seconds had passed before Ganon found himself at the stone on the eastern rise. The sounds of a scuffle came from down below in the shaded vale, and again there shot another quickly muffled scream. With the roar that gave the screaming forest its name, Ganon leapt full bore from the stone. Mid-air, he knew what was happening. A flash of blue light lit up the vale from atop the western approach, and as he sailed down to the ground, he slid and clawed to a stop in shock. Aaron had not been where he left her. Things around were not in disarray. The light at the approach grew brighter, and Ganon trembled to think of what surely was taking place. Again, he broke out into a sprint of unnatural speed, and as he crested the small hillside, let out another ear-splitting howl. With a deep and pulsating hum, accompanied by the whirl of hydraulics, Darkstar stood from the place where it had sat for decades unpowered. It turned to face Ganon with a sinewy skeleton that fell apart in its crushing grip. "Pilot," it said in a scratchy, digitized voice. "Darkstar operational and ready for service." Ganon fell to his knees in disbelief. and he sobbed with his face in his hands as his suit towered overhead. "Power levels," it continued, "1.3%. Ganon looked up from his despair. The red of the berries smeared across his face. He gazed upon the machine with a hatred that began to burn hotter for the monstrosity than ever before. Tension flexed his muscles as he stood from his place to storm toward Darkstar. As he approached, the suit's ribs expanded and pulled apart to reveal a cockpit. Long connection cables and a harness lowered to the ground, ready for Ganon to enter. But as he neared the harness, instead of strapping in, he reached for the many cables and began to tug at them with a furious might. The cables came alive as they searched for the ports around his body, but he fought them off as he continued to rip away at them. "Pilot!" Darkstar looked down at him. "Desist," it said coldly. But Ganon would not stop, and with a couple more tugs, he managed to tear a batch of cables free. Darkstar reeled backwards as it retracted the rest of the cables in the harness. Even though the suit stood nearly 3 times Ganon's own height, he continued his assault and leapt upwards onto Darkstar's thigh as he gripped a panel of armor and began to tug mightily at it, but it would not budge. "Pilot, desist," Darkstar repeated as it went to pick him up, but Ganon leapt onto its forearm and scrambled his way onto its back. He began tearing away at the wires that led from the ribcage to the head. "Desist. Power levels at 1%. Damage incurred. Remaining energy stores needed for repair. Commencing shutdown." Darkstar simply sat to the ground and turned itself off. Ganon's breaths verged on the brink of hysteria as he wheezed and wept atop the machine while repair servos whirled away beneath him. Erin was dead, because in her curiosity she had ventured too close to the silent behemoth, and without warning, Darkstar seized the moment and ate her. Well, that's it for Chapter 6, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in and hanging in. For those of you who are still watching along, I really, really appreciate it. If you want to get your own copy of A Book of Creation by Gregory James Gardner Jr., that's me, go head on over to Amazon Books, type that into the search, or you can just look in the description down below because the link is there. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't to already. If you know people who like fantasy, share the first chapter of this with them. Thank you for hanging in there. We'll see you guys next week.